City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Greg McPherson, president of City Club. For 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel along with all of you listening on OPB or viewing on Portland Community Media or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum sponsors are Chevron Corporation, Echo Northwest, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Vacasa Vacation Rentals. Please show our appreciation for all of them. Today's topic is something toxic's in the air. Poor air quality threatens our health and well-being. Today's panel will discuss how industry and environmental partners can work together to improve air quality. Mary Peveto is a mother of 3 who calls herself an accidental activist. After coming across a 2008 study listing her daughter's school as among the worst 2% in the nation for risk from toxic industrial emissions, she co-founded the advocacy group Neighbors for Clean Air. Alan Sprott is Vice President of Environmental Affairs at the shipbuilder Vigor Industrial, with responsibility for facilities in Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. Pete Shepard is the Interim Director of the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, the state agency with responsibility for dealing with air toxins. He spent a career as a lawyer with the Oregon Department of Justice, including service as Deputy Attorney General and in private practice. The moderator for our panel is Marissa Madrigal. She served as interim Multnomah County Chair for 10 months in 2013 and is now the county's Chief Operating Officer. Please welcome Mary Peveto, Alan Sprott, Pete Shepard, and Marissa Madrigal to City Club.
Good afternoon. I'm Marissa Madrigal, Multnomah County's Chief Operating Officer, here with Alan Sprott, Mary Peveto, and Pete Shepard. With some notable exceptions, many Portlanders have only recently learned that our air isn't as pristine as it looks. Thousands of us are living in toxic air hotspots, invisible, odorless plumes of cadmium, chromium, nickel, arsenic, and other heavy metals emitted by industry. Additionally, a majority of Oregonians are at risk for cancer from diesel pollution, with the highest concentrations in neighborhoods with low-income residents and people of color. We're going to spend the hour focused on what we can do as a community, people, business, and government to make Portland and Oregon's air healthy and safe. But first, I think it's important to understand where we've been. So, Mary Peveto from Neighbors for Clean Air, how did we get here?
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you for this opportunity today, and thank you to City Club. So I would say you mentioned with notable exceptions, many people on February 3rd learned that we had really toxic air. I think the notable exceptions of the people who knew, though, for a long time before, include our Oregon Department of Environmental Quality and, frankly, our elected leaders. Because in 2003, Oregon Department of Environmental Quality was guided by the legislature and presumably the governor's office to develop an air toxics program. And that was pretty prescriptive. It said that we should look to reduce toxic air pollution in our urban centers through a geographic program, as well as deal with the high cost of fence line emissions through a safety net program of industrial pollution. So I do think that this goes back to 2003, where it was recognized that air toxics as a category of pollution was not being well addressed, and our state took the action to say that we should be addressing this.
Pete or Alan, any perspective to add about where we've been?
Well, I think that, you know, we've worked with DEQ for 20 years in managing our permits, and we hold just about every permit known to mankind at our facility. Our experience with DEQ has been pretty professional throughout, particularly in the air quality arena, but that's because we hold this permit, which there is a pretty rigid regulatory framework around, and we hold it, we hold what's called a Title V permit, which is the biggest air permit that you can possibly have. So we engage regularly with DEQ in management of our permit questions that we have. And so our experience has been different than, I think, Mary's experience in looking at the broader airshed in Portland because, you know, like I said, we're focused on managing our permits.
For me, the answer to your question doesn't start in 2003 or 20 years ago. It starts on April 20th, 2016. And that's not to say that I'm not interested in what happened before, because for me, here is the beginning of a chance to reformulate the way we address the question of toxins in our environment. And the vehicle for that, and we'll talk, I'm sure, more about it today, is Cleaner Air Oregon. And I began during a commission meeting at which this functionally was the opening of what will be an 18-month-long process to reach a better way of accommodating regulation in the context of human health as an explicit goal and public health as fundamental principles. I am interested in what went before because it may help inform us as to how to get it right during the Cleaner Air Oregon rulemaking process. And I hope that as we engage in that process, that people who have the length of history that my co-presenters have with this whole thing will bring the lessons that they perceive to bear on that rulemaking process so that we can anticipate and blunt the problems that they identify.
Thank you. So, Pete, one of the questions I have moving forward into how we solve this is this question about technology. Does the technology exist to capture these toxic emissions?
Marissa, I'm not a technical expert, and so I can't answer it from a technical standpoint. But I can tell you that in the Cleaner Air Oregon process, a core component of that process is to set up what's called a technical advisory committee. And these are people who do have the expertise and the training and experience academically as well as in the field to help answer that question in the context of the rulemaking process. That's part of what their function is, and we're at the stage right now in identifying who those folks will be and extending the invitations to begin that work.
Mary Peveto, do you have any as an advocate and maybe some knowledge of what other states or other places are doing? Does the technology exist to protect our air, or are some of these industrial processes incompatible with neighborhoods and schools?
I'd say absolutely the technology exists, but this goes beyond technology. I think that what the missing component at this point is the will to do this. And I think that any place that you analyze where successful programs have been implemented to address toxic pollution, what you see first and foremost is that a standard has been set that needs to be met. And once that mandate exists to meet a standard, then the technology and the feasibility of how to get there all falls in place. So I would absolutely say that there are tremendous number of examples out there where standards have been set and those have been met successfully.
Okay. Alan, anything to add on the technology piece from the business perspective?
Sure, I agree with what Mary said, but I would also emphasize that the technology exists to control industrial emissions. A lot of the problems that we have in the airshed in Portland are not from industrial emissions. They're from vehicle emissions and from wood-burning stoves. And that one is a bigger problem because now you have to go out and everybody in this room is contributing to that problem. And how do you mobilize people around a common goal to clean up the air?
Great, thank you. One thing that I've been struck by is a little bit of the mystery behind the source of some of these emissions. For example, DEQ reported several weeks ago that a new unidentified source was emitting hexavalent chromium, which is the metal that made Aaron Bronkovich famous. How is it that we don't know where these toxics are coming from? Pete?
Well, Marissa, I think that goes to one of the lessons of the past that I think the agency before my arrival had begun to address, and I think it's one of the things that needs to be looked at in the context of Cleaner Air Oregon in terms of, and specifically when the City Club did its former report, it accurately reported that we had 3 monitors in the entire agency. Monitors capable of, for instance, helping us establish the scope of emission from a particular source and zeroing in on a particular source. Today we have 55, and we have plans to add some more. In addition, we have some we borrowed from the EPA. So part of the answer, I think, is that we have not had the capacity to zero in, the tools to zero in on some of these locations. And I think we're adding that capacity, but we're far short of what we need to do.
Mary?
Well, I would argue, though, that frankly we've had the knowledge, and again, so it doesn't feel like this has been a 100% information bereft issue. Frankly, the number 2 listed polluter or emitter of hexavalent chromium in our state is ESCO Steel, and it's in my neighborhood. And for years, one of those few monitors actually demonstrated that Northwest Portland was one of the highest areas where the hexavalent chromium met most consistently the highest levels. So it hasn't been a lack of information that has been this problem. It's been the lack of the mandate and the will to do something about what we did know. I would frankly have said that if we could have acted in 2007, between 2007 and 2011, to the information we knew about cadmium and arsenic in North Portland at that Roselawn test site, I think we would have found the Southeast Portland a lot sooner. But there always seems to be this excuse to not act based on lack of information as opposed to act on the information we have. And I think that we have for too long not been willing to act and take the mandate that we have to reduce pollution that we know about. So I think it never seems like there's going to be enough data to convince certain people that that's an impetus to act. But I think from the communities and the neighborhood standpoint, we all know that there has been enough for a long time.
Thank you. So a question for all 3 of you, but I'll start with you, Alan. Your company, Vigor Industrial, has locations in Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. How do Oregon's regulations and standards compare to other cities and states where Vigor operates?
Generally the same, because all 3 locations are first following their delegated states, so the feds set the rules and then the states take the responsibility. It is different operating in Alaska, of course, because there's not the population density that you see in Oregon and Washington. Specifically to the air quality programs, the state of Washington has individual air quality districts, as opposed to the way Oregon does it except for Lane County, the DEQ, the state's running the air quality programs. And there is a difference between how we operate between those 2 environments. And some parts of it are better and some parts of it are not as good. But generally speaking, I think that management of our permit under the Oregon program feels a little more comprehensive. The permits are better put together than they are in Washington State, but generally the standards are about the same.
What does better mean? If I could follow up on that, what is a better process or a better permit? The
permit is much better organized in Oregon than we see in the other 2 locations, because you have different air quality districts. They'll each they're tailoring it to their own, and so for a company operating in multiple locations, it's difficult to track it and do things that are required by these permits in the same way. Having a single point of contact at DEQ to deal with our quality issues has certainly been helpful. And a person who has stuck with our facility, our permit manager's been there for almost 15 years. So he knows our facility, and it's just we're able to engage with them much easier than we are in our other locations. But again, they both have their pros and cons.
Pete?
Marissa, from my perspective, having the shorter history, one of the lessons that I think is significant about and different about Oregon than compared to California and Washington is that those states do have, in one form or another, a regulatory structure that expressly links human health directly to the authority that they exercise under their rules. And that, I think, is a significant lesson from the past that is part of the motivation for the Cleaner Air Oregon effort, and that is to recognize that there are other models in the country that we can borrow from and perhaps learn from in restructuring our regulations so that they connect best principles of public health to science and to our regulatory structure. There's a famous Supreme Court opinion in which the Supreme Court refers to states as the laboratories of democracy. Well, that's what we have. We have the opportunity to learn in the Cleaner Air Oregon process from the experience of our neighbors and other states all across the country. And I hope that folks will bring to that process a comparative analysis of their perception of how it is to work and live and play in those states under those different regulatory schemes.
Thank you for that, Pete. That actually, I understand that Louisville, Kentucky created a regional air authority and used health-based standards that have been pretty successful. They found out about their air quality issues around the same time Portland did, but kind of took a different path. And so I'd like to delve a little bit into that health-based standard versus technology-based standard, and I'll be totally transparent in that. I'm asking, as a community member, as somebody who lives with her 2 children in a nickel hotspot in southeast Portland, what is the difference for me and my family between a health-based standard and a technology-based standard?
Well, from a regulatory standpoint, the current standards are pegged essentially to the volume of emission. And while that may be distantly related to a judgment about public health or human safety, there's no necessary connection between that standard. And so under the current regulatory standard, and this is one of the lessons of our history, is that there was a gap, as we perceive it, that arose because those standards are not necessarily pegged to levels that make sense in terms of the best practices of public health and science. And so this Cleaner Air Oregon effort at its core is an effort to connect those things explicitly. I'm not sure exactly how it will play out in the case of a particular facility or a particular location, but after all, that's the purpose of the inquiry that is the basis of the rulemaking process.
Mary?
Well, I think I would agree, actually, that is the distinction, that technology-based standard is a standard that says, a facility has to have X widget to reduce pollution, but then there's no residual risk analysis that says, does that mean that then their emissions are safe? And so a health-based standard would move to the other way around, which is that one facility can only emit so much until it is unsafe to the community that resides next to it. And so I think there's actually a pretty clear pathway that, again, we don't design and develop, and Louisville STAR didn't set out to say that every company had to do X, Y, and Z. Louisville STAR program said no company can emit more than would create excess risk of 1 in a million cancers to the community outside of it. And every single facility had to meet that standard at their fence line. And that's a pretty straightforward ask, and then it's up to developing, all the feasibility or the compliance with that standard. And I think that that's the biggest issue that I still have with Cleaner Air Oregon is it is speaking towards health-based standards, but that has to be set. That has to be set by leadership before you can develop a program. And since right now nobody is stating what the goal and intention of the air standard will be, then we have no idea how to judge the efficacy or the work that's going to happen as the program is designed. So I really think at some point, in a very short period of time, we need to know what the goal that Oregon is asking for to be so that everybody has certainty about what we're trying to do.
Marissa, I very gently disagree with my co-panelist on the question of whether leadership should establish what those principle, what the outcome should be before the process turns. Maybe that's not what you intended, Mary, but to me, a critical part of the Cleaner Air Oregon process is to drive public engagement, and including driving it into parts of the community that, frankly, the government has not reached out well to over time, underserved communities in particular. And I think that what this process is, the end objective, the leadership objective, is to yield a set of regulations that connect science and best principles of public health as the explicit underpinning for our regulatory scheme for industrial sources. The way we get there is not by the leadership preordaining what those regulations look like. It is instead by extraordinary consultation with the community that's going to play out, starting with, I think, a webinar as the first event on coming up very soon. And so I think that I would disagree, I think, about the emphasis on beyond stating the objective, which is, as I say, to connect public health and science to our regulatory base. I think the process itself is crucial if we're going to arrive at a set of regulations that make sense for the community and for the broader community. These are, after all, we're trying to make regulations that will affect every Oregonian in every part of the state, and that's a big challenge.
So you brought up an excellent point and something I was going to ask about later on, and that I'd love all your different perspectives on. It's clear that the issues that we have in our air do disproportionately impact low-income people and communities of color. And when I think about, we were at this art show at my son's school, and all the parents, the busy, harried parents that are living in this toxic cloud, and our capacity to engage in community process. What is the commitment, and how will you ensure, from each of your perspectives as a business person, community person, government person, that those voices and frankly, I'm not, I'm sure a webinar isn't the whole plan, but how will you engage? And I don't know who wants to start first.
Well, I think strictly speaking from the industry perspective, one, on the issue of technology-based standards versus health-based standards, we're already doing health-based standards on the water quality side in our water quality permits, and it's working. So I think that the challenge there is enough lead time, because in some cases you're not going to have the technologies available to meet those health-based standards at the fence line, like Mary was saying, and there needs to be enough lead time for the private sector to develop those technologies to put in place. So that would be one point. One of the things that is missing, I think, generally in industry is an explanation of what are the priorities, because what industry deals with is what's in front of them. And if the regulatory agencies are saying, we want you to rewrite this plan over this X many times, that's what we're going to do. We're going to spend our time rewriting plans, or we're going to spend our time, doing whatever it is the agency is focusing on. This issue of the air quality has never been put out there as a priority for industry to deal with. So how does industry know what they should be focusing on if the CEOs of the various companies, or the plant managers of various companies operating that have permits and are doing industrial emissions in the city, were receiving visits from the Petes of the world and saying, here's the priorities that this agency has for air toxics. This is why it's a priority in our community, and we want you on board to help with us. I think there would be the path that we're seeing now of monitoring data, picking up a hotspot somewhere, and then everybody getting concerned about it. We wouldn't see that nearly as much as we're seeing right now.
So clear expectations.
Clear expectations, and what's the priorities, and why.
And just to loop back on the question about community involvement, I don't want to lose that thread. How has Vigor engaged with community?
Well, we just finished a large project with Neighbors for Clean Air and Mary's group, where we reached out with the community. There were some concerns about air quality issues from our operation on Swan Island, and solved the problem. So I think to everybody's satisfaction, the result that we got, including our satisfaction, we're very pleased with the results and the whole process. So we're all in on community involvement.
Thank you. Mary?
So, yeah, we're all in on community involvement too, but this isn't our job. I would say there's 90% of people in Oregon now face an excess cancer risk due to diesel pollution and other pollution. And I'm pretty sure that if you want community feedback, we'd all say we don't want that. We don't want to be at excess risk of cancer and illness due to air pollution. So, and based on my previous work writing business plans and others, objectives are not goals. Again, we need a goal set today that says we don't want anybody in Oregon to face the negative health consequences due to avoidable, unnecessary air pollution. And I think that that is true. We know the technology exists today to reduce 99% of the diesel particulates in our state. We know through work with individual companies that it is possible to meet a 1 in a million standard at each fence line. So again, until those goals are absolutely set and that mandate is given, this process of objectives is meaningless because none of us can have buy-in to what and a shared understanding of what we're trying to do.
Let me speak directly to the question you asked. I don't, in my experience in government, I don't think we have done as well as we should and could have in engaging the full community. People who have full-time jobs can't get to a hearing that's held in the middle of the day. Not everybody has access to a webinar. Lots of folks can't drive to Salem to go to a meeting in the Capitol building. And as I reflect back on my experience in state government, I've been in scores of meetings that were held in the middle of the day and in Salem, and we would sit in the room and wonder why we didn't have more involvement. Cleaner Air Oregon is going to drive into is going to try to avoid the lessons we've learned. So we're going to have the hearings. There'll be a series of 4 community forums, not the only point of engagement for sure, but 4 community forums, and we plan to have those in the evening. They will be, we will take it on the road. We're going to take it to all of Oregon because we are dealing with an issue that has to be addressed at the statewide level as well as at the local level, as Alan and Mary so creatively have done with the Good Neighbor negotiations and process. So I think to your question, I think the government has the obligation to try and create the opportunity for folks in the community to come together. Now, I agree with Mary that it's not news to us that people want to avoid exposure to dangerous chemicals in the environment, to toxins. The reason we want to have the engagement is that, frankly, we think people who are in those communities may have some creative ideas that we wouldn't have thought of if we were just sitting around trying to imagine what the best rule looked like. That's why we do this engagement process. It's not an exercise. It's an opportunity to tap the creativity of Oregonians who are most vested in solving the problem. That's why we want to hear from them.
Okay, thank you. In case you're just tuning in, I'm Marissa Madrigal, moderating the Portland City Club Friday Forum, Something Toxic is in the Air at the Sentinel Hotel in Portland, Oregon. We're joined by our esteemed panelists, Mary Peveto, Alan Sprott, and Pete Shepard. So this discussion about standards, I had a question in here about a moral imperative. It's really easy to get kind of caught up in the check boxes and lose sight of what the goal is, which in my mind is clean air for Oregon. So what is our responsibility as humans to reach for a moral imperative and to have that be our guiding principle?
So I think that the folks like me who are in charge of trying to help shape these policies develop and ultimately hopefully achieve a solution that all Oregonians can support, I think we have to start with a frank acknowledgement that people are frustrated and disappointed and are expressing disappointment with the way we've dealt with this issue to date. And I think as a starting point for the regulator, we have to be consciously aware of that fundamental concern about the way we have performed, because that, after all, is the motivation that we ought to bring to bear on the rest of the process that has to follow in order to translate our understanding and appreciation and empathy for that expression. That's the motivation for harnessing that to the end outcome that's actually an enforceable rule that we can use to help respond more effectively in the legal system to those very legitimate frustrations and concerns.
Mary Peveto or Alan?
Go for it, Mary.
I do think we have a moral imperative because I think that this is not people's jobs to come to hundreds of hours of hearings and meetings to provide you more feedback that they don't want to be poisoned by air toxics. One of my frustrations, again, and is, well, I acknowledge that you are new to this. I think as citizens, we expect that there to be institutional knowledge is passed through our agencies and our public offices. In 2003, when the mandate was set by the state government that our state was supposed to deal with the air toxics issue that was problematic, something was all set in motion, and that culminated in 2011 with the end of the Portland Air Toxics Solutions. The advisory committee met from 2009 to 2011. So that was almost a decade's worth of knowledge, a decade's worth of monitoring information, a decade's and 2.5 years of developing reams of white papers for every single category and every single source on air toxics in the Portland metro area. We have information. We know how this can happen. What we don't have today is a mandate to do it. We didn't have it then as part of the Portland Air Toxics Solutions. We still don't have it today as part of Cleaner Air Oregon. That is the missing component. Do we have a standard that we need to meet? Because really, more process, more hearings to hear from more people is not going to get us there. A mandate will.
Well, Marissa, we do. I'd respectfully disagree. I think we do have a very clear mandate, and it is a mandate for the very first time to connect the basis of our rules to principles of science and best principles of public health and the impact on humans. That's a new mandate. That was not in place previously. And as I said before, I am interested in the history of that previous effort, and I would very much like people who have a perspective on why it didn't work to come forward in the process of Cleaner Air Oregon and to use that to help inform the ultimate decision-making by the Environmental Quality Commission about the adoption of the final rules, because as a citizen, I'll just be a citizen like the rest of the folks here when that happens, and I will want to know that that rulemaking process took into account whatever the reasons are for why that previous effort apparently did not satisfy, evidently did not satisfy members of the community.
So we talked about our lofty goals, and now I want to talk about something a little more cold and hard, money. Is there evidence, and I'll start with you, Alan, that environmental regulations hurt business? And what has been Vigor's experience as you've taken out permits and tried to work with neighbors? Does it hurt the bottom line?
Well, I think bad implementation of regulations hurts business for sure. And we see costs that we absorb that we shouldn't have, that are unnecessary, because in some cases there's bad implementation of regulations, no doubt. But I think that what we're seeing with this air toxics issue in Portland is bad for business. That this is being paid attention to elsewhere. My company has grown through a lot of mergers and acquisitions over the last 8-9 years. And in every case, we go into a community where we're looking at doing an acquisition or a startup, and we do our due diligence. And a big part of that is, what is the environment like for environmental regulations? This would stick out like a sore thumb in our due diligence, and we probably would not want to mess with it. So this is bad for business. It's bad for economic growth. And so however we get to some solution on this, I think that you know, the case can be made that a solution to this that's comprehensive is better than what we've got now.
Thank you. Mary?
So I can only speak to one example. When Art Williams was tasked by the mayor of Louisville to develop the Louisville, Kentucky STAR program, the mayor said, first, I want you to reduce the pollution and protect health from this pollution. And second, I don't want you to lose any jobs. And he was able to do both. They didn't lose a single job in Louisville, Kentucky, in a very traditional old industry that has been an incredibly important part, what they call Rubber Town in Louisville. And at the same time, they met 95% of their goal to reduce the pollution to no more than 1 in a million cancers across many companies. And it was done 100% through voluntary compliance with that standard. So my sense is that actually in 40 years of the Clean Air Act, that there is a huge economic analysis of the tremendous amount of growth that we've had in our economy in that period of time, that actually we see $20 return for every dollar in investment in air emissions regulations per the analysis of the Clean Air Act and the regulations that have been in place. So I think that there is a strong track record for how actually a healthy environment fuels a healthy economy. And more cities are stepping up to say that we have to have healthy environments for the places we do business. And so I think that the question should be not what is the cost of this regulation, but what is the cost of not doing it? How can we afford to let another generation of children and Oregonians die at the hands of unnecessary pollution? And how can we let the cost of the other non-cancer, non-death outcomes that we're seeing in neurodevelopmental problems and autism and others increase for the near roadway emissions? How can we keep letting this go? How can we afford this? We can't.
Pete Shepard.
Marissa, I think you've asked a core question that will have to be examined during the course of Cleaner Air Oregon, and that is that how do we successfully pursue both a healthy economy and a healthy environment? And those questions, I understand from my public health colleagues, are connected in a very direct way, because I'm told that there's quite a lot of evidence from public health world that an unemployed family is less healthy than an employed family. And so I think when we're looking at the total contribution to the health of the community, I think the question you asked is a pertinent question also on the health front. And if there's a way to do it in which we achieve both simultaneously, that's wonderful. That'd be great. But I think it's a question that I think the policymakers are ultimately going to have to ask as they examine the choices they face.
I'll push a little bit because one of the other things that builds wealth is property value. And I think there is evidence that once it's known that there's an air quality issue in a neighborhood, people lose wealth through their property. So it's to me there is this bigger question of the total picture, that yes, employment is important, but so are all these other factors. And so how do we put that equation together in the Cleaner Air Oregon process?
Marissa, I agree with your proposition that's relevant, and that is explicit direction of the guidance that we're giving the Cleaner Air Oregon process. It really is a search for a way to identify a healthier Oregon, both in terms of the environment and in terms of economic enterprise. And I think on the economic side, I agree with I think both of the speakers that in the mix of economic benefit, Oregon is an attractive place to come because of its environment, is itself a potential economic benefit that needs to be weighed in the picture. So I don't think the economic consideration necessarily cuts in any one direction, but in the pursuit of a healthy economy alongside a healthy environment, I think there are ways to connect those, but I think it's a relevant question to ask about the process.
Mary, did you have something additional to add?
Last I checked the org chart at Department of Environmental Quality, there is no economist on staff, and I really think that it is misguided to have our Department of Environmental Quality making decisions about economic feasibility when it doesn't actually have the capacity to do that analysis. I think that decision and that analysis is done in a different area. We as the public have charged our Department of Environmental Quality to protect the environment and to put forward the most and strongest policy recommendations to do that. And again, I would actually say that once you get an economist on staff or otherwise consult one, if you do the benefit cost analysis of air emissions regulations over the breadth of the last almost half century, you will actually find out that it'll net gain for the benefit of stronger regulations.
In case you're just tuning in, I'm Marissa Madrigal, moderating the Portland City Club Friday Forum, Something Toxic is in the Air, at the Sentinel Hotel in Portland, Oregon. We're joined by our esteemed panelists, Mary Peveto, Alan Sprott, and Pete Shepard. Alan, you mentioned working earlier that you and Mary have worked together in the community around Vigor's site. Can you talk a little bit more about how that process worked, what didn't? You know, it's kind of in the absence of stronger regulations. I understand that a community benefit agreement was reached between the neighbors and your company.
Sure. So just for a little background, our facilities on Swan Island down just below the bluff from the University of Portland, and we operate a large wastewater treatment plant there, as well as shipbuilding and repair operations. And we started noticing a couple of years ago a rash of nuisance odor complaints that were coming from our neighbors up on the bluff, and some were directed at us and some were directed at other industrial operations. But my company we wanted to engage with that and find out what the problem was, and then if we could implement a solution. And so we started looking for part of the challenge is, who do you engage with? I mean, we have neighborhood associations, but we needed somebody that would help kind of bring everybody together, and we were aware of Neighbors for Clean Air through its work with ESCO. And so we reached out to Mary and established, sort of what our goals were for this effort, and then established a process. And Mary helped us work with rounding up the right people, and we engaged with the University of Portland to do some of the science work that was involved, and peer review the engineering work that we had our consultants doing. And ultimately, the goal was to eliminate the nuisance odor source that was associated with our operations. And then a secondary goal that came out of that effort was, let's look for areas where there's opportunity to reduce toxic emissions from our facility and incorporate those into the Good Neighbor Agreement, but then also incorporate that into our Title V permit, so that there's some certainty for the neighbors that going forward, we're going to follow through and do what we said that we're going to do. So the process took about 18 to 24 months to accomplish. We learned a lot along the way, and we learned a lot about our facility that we didn't know along the way, that has been useful to us, and we'll be using that in the future as well. So all in all, a very positive experience, I think.
Mary?
Yeah, I mean, it was a great experience working with Vigor, and it was a really unusual situation because it's the only situation that we've had the opportunity to engage in where the company came 100% voluntarily to the table. There was no other real impetus, although I do want to give huge credit to ESCO as well, because, frankly, while there was a lot more, I think, pressure and community agitation in the area of ESCO, I mean, they really did also choose to take this pathway of voluntary engagement. And really, the engagement, I mean, Good Neighbor Agreements get, bantied around a lot and misunderstood about what they are or they aren't. I mean, one of the tenets and values that we have about any direct negotiation is that what we're really looking for are stronger permit conditions. We're looking for the elements of continuous improvement and emission reduction prioritization that would then become part of a state enforced permit. And so, as was the case with ESCO, through a very transparent third-party engineering process to be able to evaluate and prioritize the emissions and where we could see reductions. That template was what we presented to Alan when he reached out to us. We said, we want third-party transparent evaluation to be able to help us prioritize what should be reduced. Pretty early on, we identified we wanted to make sure that toxics were considered, that this really wasn't just about odors, although we wanted that evaluated as well. And then whatever the highest priority toxics, to give ESCO great credit again, they basically, everything that was identified as high risk and toxic that there was an engineering solution to, they committed to doing that. So it ended up to be 17 emission reduction actions. And Vigor the same. I mean, as long as something was identified and there was an engineering solution to it, we could make that an enforceable condition of their permit. So it's a really great process. It's actually what I think we all would like the state to be doing. I think that's what we actually expect is being done in the course of 5-year permit renewals, that every single one of those permit renewals is an opportunity for improvement, an opportunity for pollution reduction, and that I think is what is most surprising to most of lay people who don't spend their time doing this all the time, is that it's not. And so this is very much the model, I think, of what we think regulation can do as well.
Well, I want to applaud Mary and Alan for the work they did on that, because I think it was very creative, and I think it helped deal with the problem that they mutually confronted. It's a very good thing, and I think if there are some lessons to be drawn from that, I think they ought to be drawn into the Cleaner Air Oregon model, so that can inform us about how that regulatory reform effort should be structured going forward. And I think there probably are some lessons in that experience. And again, I just want to congratulate both of them on that work. It's really great work. I particularly want to congratulate Alan, because I think in the model that his company has set, I think that other companies that are engaged in, that have issues, would be well advised to look to the experience that Alan has had and see if there's something that they can do in a new and creative way to reach out to their own neighbors. And it may not be the same solution, but I would encourage other folks in industry to look at that as an additional way of dealing with some of these issues.
That's a great point, Pete. Before we go to City Club member questions, Alan, do you have any parting words of advice for businesses that may be reluctant to engage with the community for whatever reason, and what steps they could take to engage?
It's not a scary process. And for us, it's helped us cultivate this attitude within our company that this is our culture, that we're trying to walk our talk, and it's just not about environmental, it's about safety, it's about production, it's about how we engage with our customers. That, you can say all these things within inside of a company, but if you don't actually do them, then they're meaningless. And so this was useful for us internally in building our culture too, is that we say we want to act responsibly when it comes to the environment. And so then when the opportunity came up to do something with it, we acted on it. And that was observed by our employees. And by the way, our employees live in these neighborhoods. We don't fly people in from a pristine planet every day to work. They live in these neighborhoods. So this is our people too. So no, it's not that scary.
Thank you. We will now go to questions from the audience. Asking questions is a benefit of City Club membership, but anyone may write a question on one of the index cards found at the center of your table, and City Club staff will collect it.
I'm Spencer Ehrman. I'm a member of City Club. 3 years ago, City Club published its report on air toxics in the Portland airshed. Among other conclusions, we learned that the leading sources of air toxics in the Portland airshed are diesel exhaust and wood smoke. And it is the adopted position of City Club that DEQ should move toward reducing our exposure to toxics from those sources, and all sources for that matter. At the direction of the legislature, DEQ formed a statewide task force to study the wood smoke issue and recommend legislative action to help reduce wood smoke from older, unsafe wood stoves, but no action has been taken on the leading source of air toxics, diesel exhaust from older truck and construction equipment engines. Both California and Washington have far more stringent regulation that results in lower incidence of respiratory disease, cancer, and premature death. In spite of the economic modeling that's been done that shows that diesel exhaust costs Oregon businesses and taxpayers over $3 billion a year, that's with a B, DEQ has not moved to implement the stringent rules that are already within its authority and has sought no additional authority or legislation to move toward the highest standards set by California. My question is...
Thank you.
Sorry. Considering DEQ's and state executives' lack of leadership and will, why shouldn't the metro area reform the Columbia-Willamette Regional Air Quality Authority, fire DEQ, and just get on with the business at hand? And I all the panelists to address the question. Thank you.
Who'd like to take a crack at that one first?
Well, I think that's mine.
Pete Shepard.
Let me address first the question of the formation of a regional air protection district. And here I wouldn't presume to say what Multnomah County or any other jurisdiction should do. I think the most contribution I can make to that question is to just pose 3 questions that I think would be relevant to any policymaker considering that alternative. The first question is, Can you establish a system that will provide stable funding for that organization? The statute provides that the organizations are funded partially by the state, but the local jurisdictions have to make contribution up to 50% in certain circumstances. So the first question would be to carefully examine the question of whether you can provide a stable funding base for the entity that you would then be relying upon after you'd fired me from doing the work. The second thing that I think you'd want to carefully examine if you were the decision maker is providing political stability. In what's defined to be the Portland airshed, you have many counties. You got Multnomah County, Washington County, Clackamas County, part of Yamhill County, not to mention Clark County across the river. And the governing board of a regional district by state law is composed of the representatives of each of the subordinate jurisdictions, and in fact, many cities within each of those county participants. So the question of the political governance and the establishment of an equitable way to determine the policy for that organization is a question that I'd urge any policymaker thinking about this option to look at. And then I think the third consideration for a policymaker would be to ask the question of, is it good policy to establish a different set of rules for different parts of the state? You have a basic level that all the protection districts would have to comport with, but you would also have the possibility of higher standards in one part of the state than in another. And I don't know what all the consequences of that would be, but certainly we know that economic activity can be affected by the relative regulatory burden in different jurisdictions. So one question you'd ask is, what effect will the establishment here be of something with a higher standard on the distribution of economic activity? I don't know what the right answer to those things are, but those are the questions I would ask. That's what I'd say.
Mary or Alan? Care to weigh in? Mary Peveto.
Again, when you look at best practices and you look across the country, the more local decision-making, the more where local air districts and jurisdiction resides, I think we've had more effective policy to improve the air quality. And I think that is something that absolutely needs to be on the table here. The state has had, since 2003, when it established its geographic program, it's had 13 plus years to do something about the Portland Metro air shed problem. Now, it actually only takes 2 contiguous municipalities. So the idea of whether this would be regional or hyper-local, I mean, Louisville, Kentucky did that at the mayor's level, mayor's decision, and the city level. That has also happened in places like Houston, Texas, where the mayor has stepped in to actually challenge EPA on air quality standards because of needing to protect Houstonians more rigorously. I think that where there is single leadership, I guess I don't understand how any of those 3 questions get better answered by the state than they would by local leaders, especially local leaders that can be held more accountable in a local airshed. So I would argue that I think it's really important. I think that the cost to regulate, we pay at the state level. We could pay it more effectively at the local level. Yes, we get 50%, but there's other things that get matched into that. And I just think that none of those questions would preclude a local solution.
Alan Sprott.
Well, I'm not a policy wonk kind of guy, but I think, there are agencies that we deal with that are not DEQ, that are at the local level that are not nearly as good as DEQ. So there's the risk, too, that you just move the problem from one department to another department. So I'd like to see how it's funded. If we're going to just throw another agency out and starve it like we did DEQ, we're going to get kind of the same. So it's a kind of a package. Maybe it is a better idea to have some regional entity stand up for a while to solve this immediate issue that we have with the diesel particulate and wood smoke, because I think that's going to take a little bit of a local flavor to accomplish. But I just wouldn't want to swap out DEQ for some other thing, because DEQ is an established agency statewide and could share resources that maybe a local agency wouldn't be able to do.
Thank you. Next question.
I'm Rob Johns. I'm a City Club member. I've recently moved to Hayden Island and have received certain emissions from American Petroleum Environmental Services. And there was a recent forum on that. And one of the comments was that DEQ could not come on premises with permission of the owner to test the emissions if it meant they would have to put something to reduce those emissions. Every 2 years, I take my car to DEQ. Thousands of people do it, and you put a probe up my tailpipe. Why can't you put a probe up the tailpipes of the stacks of this city and simply find out what's going on when we have things like benzene, dioxane, naphthalene, chloroform, hydrogen sulfide with questionable amounts? And if you're a chemist, you understand that. I don't know how many chemists are in this room. I mean, there aren't that many of them, but we rely upon government to watch for us. That's what we pay government for, to make our lives orderly and make sense of this crazy world a little bit better. But I would say DEQ has failed, and it's failed people who've paid very good money in taxes not to see it fail. Thank you.
Pete Shepard.
Well, I want to speak to the question of authority to inspect, because I'm not sure it's correct. I think as a condition of permits, the permittee does have the duty to allow us to do inspections, including some very intrusive ones. So I would say of that part of the question, I'm not sure I agree with the factual. In fact, I'm sure I don't agree with the factual premise.
One more question.
Hi, I'm Tamara DeRitter. I'm a City Club member as well. And I have a question about how DEQ has been involved with the City of Portland's comprehensive plan for the next 20 years. There's a state mandate and requirement by the Oregon revised statutes and the OARs that says that the cities or jurisdictions need to coordinate with state agencies when they conduct land use plans. Could you speak to the effectiveness that has happened between DEQ and the City of Portland, and why the city is still putting high-density residential next to high-trafficked corridors that have the highest level of diesel? Thank you.
Sure. So
Pete Shepard. Go ahead.
I can't answer for the city, but and as to the DEQ's involvement in the planning process, I don't know the history of that. I haven't delved into it. But I do think there is a potential zoning planning relationship here, and I'm in dangerous territory because I'm in the presence of the director of the LCDC here in the audience. But I will just say that one of the broad statewide goals does connect the question of a healthy the health of the community to the overall goals that each plan must reflect in the local planning process. And I would predict that one of the outcomes of Cleaner Air Oregon is going to be a growing awareness of the significance of health-based concerns in the formulation of local comprehensive plans. How that's played out in the past, I can't answer that question, but I do think that's going to be a part of our future in Oregon.
Mary and Alan, any final thoughts on land use planning?
Well, we're not going to land use plan ourselves out of this predicament unless we set mandates and regulations in place to really protect. I really honestly believe that good regulations like good fences make good neighbors. And I think that the problem that we have currently without these mandates is there's just going to be too many people left behind. And too often that is going to be the people of color and the low-income people that are next to these freeways often and that are experiencing things like diesel exhaust at 3 times the level of white counterparts. And I think that this is a mandate, a moral mandate, and it's a state mandate that we need to meet to put the regulations in place that can make our urban environment the goal that we want it to be, which is a healthy and vibrant place for everybody to live and work and play and to live into the next century.
We're out of broadcast time and we'll have to stop for the day. If this program has inspired you to join City Club, you can do so at the registration table as you leave the room. This is Greg McPherson, President of City Club. Please join me in thanking our panel and moderator, as well as Andrew Davidson of the Friday Forum Committee who produced today's program. We're adjourned.